Here is something you can prove to yourself before breakfast is even finished. And I mean actually prove it, with nothing more than a pencil and a door frame. Right now, this morning, you are taller than you will be tonight. Not by a feeling, not by a guess, but by a real, measurable amount, sometimes as much as a full inch, gone by the time you brush your teeth before bed. Stand against a door frame this morning and make a small pencil mark at the very top of your head. Do the same thing again tonight, in the same spot, standing the same way, and look at the gap between the two marks. That gap is not a mistake in your measuring, and it is not the pencil sliding, and it is certainly not your imagination playing tricks on you at the end of a long day. It is a real, physical shrinking that happens to nearly all of us, day after day, and then quietly reverses itself while we sleep, so gently that we never feel it happen. Most people, if you ask them, would guess their height is simply a fixed number, something written down once at the doctor's office and true from morning until night without variation. It never occurs to most of us to wonder whether the number might actually be moving underneath us all day long. I want to sit with you tonight and ask a question almost nobody ever thinks to ask out loud. If your body can lose an inch of height between sunrise and sunset and simply get every bit of it back overnight, what does that tell us about the inch, or 2, or 3 that so many of us seem to lose for good, somewhere between 30 and 70? I think the answer is kinder, and a good deal stranger, than anything you have ever been told before. And I'm not here tonight to hand you a way to get taller, nor to frighten you about growing shorter. What I want instead is to show you that the two things, the small daily inch and the slow lifelong one, are truly the very same quiet process, simply moving at two entirely different speeds. Here's the shape of what I want to walk through with you this evening, laid out plainly before we begin. That small daily rise and fall in your own height, the one you can go and actually measure on your own doorframe this very week if you want proof with your own eyes rather than my word for it, turns out to be a tiny keyhole. Look through it carefully and you can see, in miniature, playing out over the course of a single day, the very same process that unfolds across an entire lifetime, only running at a pace so unbearably slow that you would never notice it happening from one month to the next. Understand the morning inch, and you understand a real piece of why we all tend to stand a little shorter later in life than we did when we were young. Not the whole of it, and I promise I will be honest with you about the rest a little later on, but a real and measurable piece of it, hiding in plain sight in a place nobody ever bothers to look. To understand where that inch actually comes from, you have to know something about your own spine that hardly anyone ever stops to explain to you properly, not even in passing. Your spine is not one long solid rod of bone, the way a lot of us picture it sitting there behind our ribs. It is a stack, one bone carefully set on top of the next, all the way from the base of your skull down to where your hips begin. Dozens of individual pieces built to move together as one, and this is the piece that matters most tonight. Between every single one of those bones sits a small cushion, and that cushion is quietly doing something genuinely remarkable that most of us go our entire lives never once stopping to think about. At its center, each of those little cushions holds a soft gel-like core that is made up mostly of water, the way a firm, healthy sponge sitting on the edge of a sink is made mostly of water even while it holds its own shape perfectly well in your hand. There is a proper medical name for these cushions, and I'm going to say it to you once, the way I like to name a thing at least a single time before I set the fancy word aside for the rest of our evening together. They are called the intervertebral discs, one sitting between each pair of bones in your spine, cushioning them the way you would expect anything asked to carry that much weight day after day for an entire lifetime to need cushioning. After tonight, I am simply going to call them what they really are underneath that name: little water-filled sponges, roughly 24 of them, stacked all the way up your back, quietly doing their patient work without ever once asking for your attention or your thanks. Now here's what actually happens to those little sponges over the course of an ordinary day, and once you know it, I do not think you will ever look at a tape measure quite the same way again. From the moment you get out of bed in the morning, gravity starts pressing down on that whole stack. Gently but constantly, every single time you sit at the table, every time you rise up out of a chair, every time you walk across a room or bend down to pick something up off the floor or carry a bag in from the car. Hour after hour, that steady, ordinary pressure squeezes a small amount of water out of each little sponge along your spine, the same way pressing your palm down on a wet sponge in the sink will slowly work some of its water back out between your fingers without you ever meaning to squeeze it at all. Each individual cushion only loses a very small amount over the course of a morning, but you have roughly 24 of these little sponges stacked one on top of another, and a very small amount, multiplied by 24, spread out across an entire day of standing and sitting and walking and simply living your life, adds up to something you can genuinely measure with your own eyes by nightfall. By the time evening comes, your whole stack has settled just slightly, sponge by sponge by sponge, and you are shorter than you were at breakfast, sometimes by close to a full inch, without a single moment of it ever feeling like anything at all. No ache, no signal. Nothing to notice except the space between two pencil marks. Then comes the part of the story I find genuinely lovely. Once you really sit and picture it happening, you go to bed. You lie down flat, and for the first long, unbroken stretch of the entire day, the weight of gravity comes off that stack of little sponges almost entirely, released all at once the moment your head touches the pillow. There is no more standing, no more sitting, no more carrying anything anywhere, nothing at all pressing down from above. And through the quiet hours of the night, while you are doing nothing more remarkable than breathing slowly and turning over in your sleep and dreaming whatever it is you happen to dream, those cushions slowly begin drawing water back into themselves, swelling gently back out toward their full, plump shape. The same way a dry sponge left resting in a shallow pool of water will slowly soak itself full again if you simply leave it alone long enough and do not disturb it. By the time your alarm goes off, the little sponges running the length of your spine have soaked back up nearly everything they gave away the day before, and you wake up this morning very nearly as tall as you were the previous morning, the whole cycle finished and ready to begin again. It is one of the quiet nightly repairs your body manages to finish in full, right on schedule, needing nothing from you at all but the simple act of lying yourself down for a good long while. Wrung out through the day, soaked full again by dawn. It has been happening to you every single night of your entire life, thousands upon thousands of times over, without you ever once feeling the water move beneath your own skin. It is worth pausing here to say that this daily loss is not identical from one person to the next, and that is exactly what you would expect once you understand where it actually comes from. Someone with a taller frame carries a longer stack of these little sponges, and so has a bit more total cushion available to give up water over the course of a day, while someone with a shorter frame naturally has less stack to work with and often shows a smaller shift by evening. A day spent mostly on your feet, lifting and carrying and moving through errands, tends to press down on that stack harder than a day spent mostly sitting quietly with a book. So the exact size of your own inch can shift a little from one day to the next, depending on nothing more mysterious than how you happen to spend it. None of that changes the underlying process itself. It only means that if you try the doorframe test yourself and find your own gap runs a little smaller or a little larger than the number I gave you earlier, you have not found an exception to anything. You have simply found your own particular version of something every single one of us is doing constantly, in a size that belongs to you and to nobody else. If you want to see what that same sponge-like process looks like when gravity is taken out of the picture almost entirely, there is nowhere better in the world to look than an astronaut. Send a person up into orbit where there is essentially no downward pull left to press on that stack of cushions at all, and something remarkable happens to them within days. With nothing left squeezing the water back out of them, the little sponges along the spine swell out further than they ever could down here on solid ground, and astronauts living up there genuinely grow taller, up to about 2 inches taller in some cases, purely because the weight has been lifted clean off their spine for weeks at a stretch. It is the very same handful of water-filled cushions we have been talking about this whole evening, simply given the rare chance to soak up more than gravity down here would ever normally allow them to hold, and it does not last forever, which I think is the most telling part of the whole thing. Within a matter of weeks after an astronaut lands back on solid ground and gravity starts pressing down on that stack again the way it always has for the rest of us, their height quietly settles right back down to where it started before they ever left. I find that almost impossibly moving. Honestly, the idea that something as ordinary and invisible as gravity is quietly shaping the exact height of every single one of us, every single day, whether we happen to be standing in a kitchen making coffee or floating 300 miles above it with the whole Earth turning slowly outside the window. The astronauts feel it in their own bodies, too. Many of them come home describing an ache low in the back during those first weeks of unexpected height, as the cushions along the spine pull taut in a way a whole lifetime under gravity had never once asked of them. And then, over a few quiet weeks back on solid ground, that borrowed height drains gently away again, cushion by cushion, until each of them stands once more as exactly the person who left the Earth months before, not a fraction taller for the whole extraordinary trip. So here, finally, is where the small daily story opens up into the much larger one, and this is the true center of everything I wanted to bring you tonight. Day to day, that whole process of wringing out and soaking back up is completely reversible, start to finish, with nothing left behind, wrung out by evening, soaked full again by morning, over and over, for years and years on end, with no lasting cost to any of it at all, a debt paid off in full every single night. But somewhere across the passing decades, something quieter and slower begins happening underneath that faithful daily rhythm. The gel at the center of each little cushion slowly starts to lose some of its old talent for holding onto water the way it once could without any effort at all. Not all at once, and never dramatically, but year over year, the core of each little sponge grows a touch less able to soak all the way back to where it once stood, even after a full, undisturbed night spent lying flat. And so the cushions, bit by bit, settle into being just slightly flatter than they used to be, this time for good, this time with nothing at night able to fully undo it. That very same water and cushion story that quietly costs you an inch by the time you go to bed tonight, run it a crawl across 30 or 40 or 50 years instead of a single day, and no longer fully reversing itself the way it once did so reliably, is a genuine part of why you likely stand a little shorter today than you did back at 30. Not a different process arriving out of nowhere in old age to trouble you. The very same one you have been living with your entire life, simply moving slower now, and no longer quite finishing the job by morning the way it used to. I want to be fair with you about the whole picture here, because I think you deserve the honest version of this, rather than the tidy one that fits neatly into a single idea. Those flattening little cushions account for roughly half of the height most people lose across a lifetime, which is a real and meaningful piece of the story, worth understanding on its own. But it is only half of it, and I am not going to pretend otherwise just because it makes for a cleaner ending. The other half comes from the bones of your spine themselves, which tend to lose a little of their density and settle a bit closer together with the passing years, along with the gentle forward ease that posture so often takes on as we get older. A slight settling through the shoulders and the upper back that has very little to do with any sponge at all. So I am not going to sit here tonight and tell you that the little cushions alone explain every inch you have lost since you were young and full grown, because that would not be true. And I promised you honesty over neatness a long time ago, the very first time we sat down together like this. What I can say for certain is that the cushion part of this story is the one piece you can actually watch happen on yourself, in real time, on any ordinary Tuesday, in that quiet inch you lose between the moment you get up in the morning and the moment you finally lie back down at night. I should also tell you something that tends to ease people's minds rather than trouble them further once they hear it plainly. If a person past 60 were to have their spine scanned for some entirely unrelated reason, a sore back, a fall, a routine checkup, the images would very often show these same little cushions looking a bit flatter and a bit drier than they did in youth, and that finding, on its own, is usually nothing to worry over at all. It shows up in the great majority of people who reach that age, whether or not they ever feel a single thing from it, which tells you plainly that this is closer to an ordinary feature of a well-used spine than it is to any kind of injury or failure. A flatter cushion on a scan is, for most people, simply a record of time passed, not a diagnosis waiting to happen, and that, I think, is what makes the whole thing worth pausing on tonight, longer than most of us ever do. That small, provable inch between your morning self and your evening self is not some unrelated party trick your body happens to perform for no reason at all. It is the very same gentle, water-based process that is, in its own slow and patient way, part of why your body stands a little differently now than it did decades ago, back when you were the one who could touch that same doorframe without stretching. Once you see it that way, the slow shrinking that comes with age stops looking like some mysterious form of decay creeping in on you from nowhere, something happening to you quietly in the dark while you were busy living the rest of your life. It starts looking instead like something far more familiar and far less frightening. It looks like the very same faithful little sponges you have relied on every single night since you were a child, still doing the exact job they have always done, only running a little slower now than they once did, the way most things in a well-used body tend to slow rather than stop. That is a genuinely different way to hold this than the one most of us grew up believing without ever questioning it, and I happen to think it is the truer one, and very likely the kinder one too. There is a quiet sort of dignity in it once you let yourself see it that way. The picture of a body that has held you upright and carried you faithfully through every ordinary day of a long life, and is simply carrying that same weight a little closer to the ground now than it did when you were young. I think of how many of us have stood against that measuring wall in a doctor's office at some point in later life, watching the little metal arm come down to rest on top of our head, and heard a number read back that felt smaller than the one we remembered from years before, and quietly assumed something in us had simply started failing. Nobody in that room ever stopped to mention the water. Nobody ever pointed out that the exact same little sponges keeping you a certain height that very morning had been faithfully wringing out and soaking back in every day since you were small enough to be measured against a kitchen wall in pencil. You were simply handed a number and left to make sense of it entirely on your own, usually by assuming the worst kind of story about your own body, the same way most of us default to the worst story whenever nobody bothers to hand us a better one. I would like tonight to be the thing that quietly rewrites that memory for you, so that the next time a number like that gets read back to you, some real part of you recognizes exactly what it is actually made of, and does not reach so quickly for worry. If any part of tonight is landing for you the way it landed for me the first time I sat down and worked through all of this properly, a quick, helps this find someone else out there who has spent years quietly wondering, without ever quite asking the question out loud to anyone, why the number at the doctor's office seems to read just a little differently than it used to on the chart from years before. Now, before I let you go tonight, let me say the thing I always try to say plainly at this point in our time together. I am not your doctor, and I want to be genuinely careful here, because there is an important difference worth drawing clearly between two very different things. A sudden drop in height, or one that arrives together with real pain, is a genuine reason to sit down with a doctor who can actually examine you properly and knows your own history, and I would never want anything I have said tonight to talk you out of having that conversation if your own body is asking for it. But the slow, quiet inch that gathers across the ordinary years, the kind we have spent this whole evening walking through together side by side, is one of the most common and most human things a body simply does, largely without any drama attached to it at all, and for most people, entirely without symptom. I have not handed you a plan tonight because a plan was never what I promised you back at the start of all this, and it certainly was never going to be one that involved stretching yourself against a doorframe or chasing some lost inch back through sheer effort and willpower. What I have tried to hand you instead is understanding, the plain and unhurried kind, the kind that does not come attached to an instruction and does not ask you to change a single thing about how you already live your days. So here is what I would genuinely love for you to do, if you are willing, before tomorrow gets away from you the way days so often do. Find a doorframe somewhere in your own house and make a small pencil mark at the very top of your head first thing in the morning, before you have done much of anything else at all. Then make another mark that same night, right before bed, standing the same way, in the very same spot. Look at the space between those two marks and know exactly what you are looking at now, because I do not think many people ever get the chance to. It is not a flaw, and it is not decline sneaking up on you while you are not watching closely enough. It is water, quietly moving in and out of 24 small, patient, faithful little sponges that have been doing this same honest work for every single day of your entire life without complaint, and will happily keep doing it again tomorrow, whether you thought to notice this time or not. Before you go tonight, tell me down in the comments where in the world you are watching this from, and whether any part of tonight surprised you the way the astronaut part surprised me the very first time I came across it and had to sit with it for a while before it fully made sense. If sitting quietly with something as ordinary as your own height and finding it a little more remarkable than you expected is something you would like to keep doing together, go ahead and subscribe. And I will be right here waiting the next time you have got a question about what is really happening underneath your own skin. Go make that pencil mark tomorrow morning, and again tomorrow night, and see the gap for yourself with your own two eyes. Now you know exactly what that gap has been quietly telling you all along, every single day, since long before you were ever old enough to hold the pencil yourself.